Доброго вечора. Вітаю в Науковому товаристві імені Шевченка. Welcome to Shevchenko Scientific Society. Сьогодні у нас презентація книжки «Переміщення, особи, спогади, щоденникові, записи і фотодокументи інженера Юхима Харченка. І мені приємно, що сьогодні цю книжку презентуватимуть дочка Стефа Харченко. Привітаємо її. І Адріан Каратницький, відомий політолог, який буде ділитися враженнями про цю книжку. Я хотів би тільки сказати про те, що ця книжка – це друге число нашої серії, мемуарної серії, яку ми започаткували в Науковому товаристві імені Шевченка. І ми будемо продовжувати це, бо це ми використовуємо в нашій архіві і наші, так би мовити, видавничі можливості. Книжка вийшла за допомогою видавництва «Критика». Вона складається з двох частин. Перша частина – це спогади Юхима Харченка, друга частина – це такий щоденник його табору Корнберг, це DP. І я думаю, що це дуже важлива книжка і дуже важливий момент для того, щоб наша історія не губилася, а була присутньою і в науковому контексті, і взагалі для читачів. Now for English-speaking audience, I would like briefly tell about the vision of this book, which was published in series Memoirs of the Shevchenko Scientific Society. Perhaps some of you know, or maybe not, that the Society maintains an archive including various documents pertaining to Ukrainian history, literature, and the event from the First and Second World Wars. So, with such wealth, we decided to begin our publishing program with memoirs stored in manuscripts. From our perspective, the testimonies of participants in the events constitute invaluable material for specialists and the broad readership, because they reflect the difficult processes of the era, albeit subjectively, of those who happen to be its participants and witnesses. Because such materials are catastrophically scarce, each manuscript is very valuable. So, how received the archive of Juchym Harczenko, which was handed over by his daughter Stefa Харченко, our archivists found interesting memoirs there. Юхим Харченко is a typical representative of his generation, having been born in eastern Ukraine during Tsarist Russia and growing up in the Soviet Union, but retained the Ukrainian spirit. His biography is full various events related to life in the Soviet Union, and most interestingly during and after World War II. Staying in displaced camps adds a significant life and historical layer for the Ukrainian post-war immigration. Even Ulas Samchuk, an immigrant writer, wrote the novel Planeta DP. According to Samchuk, this planet recreated the entire spectrum of Ukrainian society, because Lviv intellectuals, Kharkiv scientists, peasants from the Carpathian region, and laborers from Poltava region ended up there. It was truly a large planet inhabited by Ukrainians from different regions who did not want to return to the Stalinist Soviet Union. Харченко ended up to Kornberg camp In this publication, he described in details the daily life and self-organization of Ukrainians without embellishment. On the one hand, it is a personal story. On the other, the imprint and the entire era. I hope that when this book is translated into English, more readers will be able to read it and understand the author's time and life. Thank you. Прошу.
Hi. Hello, everybody, my Ukrainian friends and my honorary Ukrainian friends. Welcome to this evening dedicated. I'll do it. Oh, I'm sorry. Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to this evening dedicated to my beloved father's newly published book. I will first read in English for my honorary Ukrainians and then in Ukrainian for my Ukrainian friends. My father, Juchym Charczenko, a Ukrainian civil activist, engineer, and physics professor, was a most extraordinary person, husband, father, provider, with a compelling story of survival, courage, endurance, and patriotism. His life's journey begins in 1912 in the tiny village of Podobno in the Charczenko region of Ukraine and continues on a path of many years of challenging, dangerous, and potentially life-threatening situations. He commenced his studies at the local village school in 1919, after which time he attended a preparatory high school in the town of Umань. After graduation, he studied at a vocational school in that same city. In 1932, Juchym enrolled in the Institute of Metallurgy in Dnipropetrovsk, in the Dnipropetrovsk region. His studies were interrupted by the military draft in the Soviet army in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, where he was engaged from 1933 to 1935. After serving in the military, Juchym returned to academia, studying in the Dnipropetrovsk Mining Institute, now the National Mining Institute. In 1941, he was once again mobilized for the service, this time in the Red Army, but managed to escape through a series of petitions and his steadfast conviction against the communist cause. That same year, Juchym returned to Dnipropetrovsk and together with other Ukrainian patriots, established and became head of the political activist group, the Ukrainets. At the same time, he was affiliated with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and worked under the pseudonym Semen Khomenko as a protective measure for himself and his family. In October 1942, Juchym was arrested for his affiliation with OUN in Dnipropetrovsk and was sent to a concentration camp in Ihren, Germany. Juchym spent 2 years as a political prisoner in Buchenwald concentration camp and was then moved to a displaced persons camp, also known as DP camps, in Kornberg, Germany, where he was elected commandant of the camp. Upon the gradual dismantling of all DP camps, with only the clothing on their backs and very small, meager possessions, Tato and his family came to the United States, settling in Jersey City, New Jersey. A very proud and devoted family man and father, or Tato in Ukrainian, he spent the first few years in America working in a hot dog factory for menial wages. He attended English classes and achieved his goal, earning his engineering degree and secured a position at a prestigious engineering firm where he eventually retired. He was a longtime member of the Board of Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, the deputy head of the Organization of Defense of Four Freedoms. The name of this group is based on President Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union Address, also known as the Four Freedoms Address, which proposed that people everywhere in the world were entitled to 4 fundamental human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. He was an active member of the committee of the Church of St. Volodymyr, as well as other notable Ukrainian organizations. In spite of his complex pre- and post-World War II life and some additional financial challenges in his adopted homeland, Tato lovingly nurtured, guided, and supported all of us as best he could. He taught us strong family values and, by example, instilled upon us an incredible work ethic. Some of my fondest childhood memories of Tato includes his unique method of teaching his young, not so musically inclined daughter how to play the piano. He sliced oranges into halves and quarters to explain musical notes. I will always remember his unwavering endurance explaining algebra to a math-phobic child such as myself. After many frustrated hours, he would send me to bed and finish my homework. Of course, I never learned much algebra, but the more algebra homework he completed for me, the more I loved him. As a child, I didn't take much interest, nor was I familiar with the details of my Tato's horrific experiences during World War II. But as I got older, Tato and I spent much more time discussing his life in Ukraine, and subsequently I developed an enthusiastic interest in his fascinating history. I was so impressed that Tato chronicled every detail of his life that after much deliberation and discussion, in 1992, we commenced our collaborative effort of publishing his biography. Since Tato's handwriting was a bit difficult to decipher, I recommended that he dictate the memoirs onto tapes, which I transcribed onto my computer. It was an intensive and painstaking 4-year labor of love. So I am extremely proud that I kept my promise to Tato and that his book finally has been published. It is especially timely and unfortunately appropriate as history seems to be repeating itself in Tato's beloved Ukraine. I dedicate this book to the man who had the most profound influence on me, a man whose memory I will always cherish, my Tato, a man who during his lifetime bore witness to the brave men and women of Ukraine who fought for their country's freedom then and still today in a battle that has raged on for centuries. Tato's journey ended on December 4th, 2004, at the age of 92, but his spirit and legacy will forever be etched in our minds through the pages of his historical recollection. I would like to thank 2 staff members of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, Vasil Makhno, Office Manager and Programs Coordinator, for the superior efforts, encouragement, guidance, and especially his patience for enduring the many years of my pursuing and badgering him about the book's progress, and Anastasia Denisenko, Archives and Administrative Assistant, who I don't believe she's here, supervision and technical assistance in setting up the photography exhibit. My appreciation and very special thank you to some exceptional friends who have been such a great source of support and inspiration throughout this journey. Tamara Lashchik for editorial expertise and moral support. Andrila Stevachki for his guidance in financing the photography exhibit, and Yulia Maranchak for the Ukrainian translations and for assisting in organizing and preparing the photographs for the exhibit. And thank you for being my speech coach in Ukrainian. And now I will do my speech in Ukrainian. Wish me luck. Okay. Let me just have some water. Привіт усім і ласкаво просимо на цей вечір, присвячений нещодавно опублікованій книзі мого дорогого батька. Мій батько Юхим Харченко, український громадський активіст, інженер і професор фізики, був надзвичайною людиною, чоловіком, батьком, годувальником з неймовірною історією виживання, мужності, витривалості та патріотизму. Його життєвий шлях розпочинається в 1912 році в маленькому селі Подобно Черкаської області України і продовжуючи шляхом багатьох років складних, небезпечних і потенційно смертельних ситуацій. Він розпочав своє навчання в місцевій сільській школі в 19 році, після чого навчався в підготовчій школі в місті Умань. Після закінчення школи він навчався в професійно-технічному училищі того ж міста. У 1932 році Юхим виступив до Інституту металургії в Дніпропетровську, тепер Кам'янська-Дніпропетровська область. Його навчання було перервано через мобілізацію в радянську армію в місті Дніпропетровськ, де він служив з 1933 до 1935 року. Після служби в армії Юхим повернувся до навчання в Дніпропетровському гірничному інституті, тепер Національний гірничний університет. У 1941 році його знову мобілізували на службу. Цього разу до Червоної армії, але він зміг уникнути служби завдяки ряду петицій і своєї рішучій відмові підтримувати комуністичну ідеологію. Того ж року Юхим повернувся до Дніпропетровська, де разом з іншими українськими патріотами заснував політичну організацію «Українець», ставши її головою. Водночас він був пов'язаний з організацією українських націоналістів ОУН, використовував псевдо Семен Хоменко, щоб захистити себе та свою родину. У жовтні 1942 року Юхим був заарештований за свою приналежність до ОУН у Дніпропетровську і відправлений до концтабору в Ігрині, Німеччина. Юхим також провів 2 роки як політичний в'язень у концтаборі Бухенвальд, а потім був переведений до табору для переміщення осіб у Конбержі, де його обрали коменданта табору. Після поступового розпаду всіх німецьких таборів для переміщених осіб лише з одягом на спині та невеликою кількістю речей тато та його родина приїхали до Сполучених Штатів, оселившись в Джерсі-Сіті, штат Нью-Джерсі. Дуже гордий, відданий родині, мій батько провів перші роки в Америці, працюючи в фабриці з виробництва парівок на низьку зарплату. Він відвідував вечірні курси англійської мови і досягнув свої мети. Здобув диплом інженера, отримав роботу в престижній інженерній фірмі, де зрештою вийшов на пенсію. Він був давнім членом Українського конгресового комітету Америки, заступником голови Організації захисту з 4 свобід. Назва цієї групи основана на зверненні президента Франкліна Рузвельта до Конгресу США в 1941 році, яке також відоме як «Звернення 4 свобод», в якому пропонувалося, що люди в усьому світі мають право на 4 основні людські права: свободу слова, свободу віросповідання, свободу від нужди та свободу від страху. Він був активним членом Комітету Церкви Святого Володимира, а також інших видатних українських організацій. Незважаючи на складне життя та після Другої світової війни та деякі фінансові труднощі в його новій батьківщині, тато з любов'ю опікувався про нас, наставляв і підтримував нас, як міг. Він навчав нас сильних родинних цінностей і своїм прикладом прививав нам надзвичайну трудову етику. Один із моїх улюблених дитячих спогадів про тата – це його унікальний метод навчання своєї молодшої, не дуже музично обдарованої доньки гри на фортепіано. Він розрізав помаранчі на половинки, на четвертинки, щоб пояснити музичні ноти. Я завжди пам'ятатиму його незмінну витривалість пояснювати алгебру людині, яка її не любила, такі як я. Після багатьох годин невдач він відправляв мене спати, а сам закінчував мою домашню роботу. Звісно, я ніколи не освоїла алгебру, але чим більше домашніх завдань він робив, тим більше я його любила. Дитиною я не надто цікавилася татовим трудним досвідом із часів Другої світової війни. Та коли підросла, тато почав набагато більше розповідати про своє життя в Україні. І врешті я захопилася цією неймовірною історією. А особливо вразило мене те, як тато ретельно записував чи не кожну мить його побуту. Тож 92-го року, після тривалих роздумів і обговорень, ми почали спільно працювати над підготовленням його автобіографії. Розібрати татове письмо мені було важко, тому я запропонувала надиктувати спомини на диктофон і вже з касет переносила їх собі на комп'ютер для дальшого опрацювання. То був нелегкий клопіткий труд, напружений 4-річний проєкт, але ж то був труд любові. Це особливо вчасно і, на жаль, доречно, оскільки історія, здається, повторюється в татовій дорогій Україні. Я присвячую цю книгу людині, яка мала найбільший вплив на мене, людині, чию пам'ять я завжди буду берегти, моєму татові, людині, яка за своє життя була свідком відважних чоловіків і жінок України, що боролися за свободу своєї країни туди і досі, у боротьбі, яка триває вже століттями. Шлях тата завершився 4 грудня 2004 року у віці 92 років, але його дух і спадщина назавжди залишаються в наших серцях через сторінки його історичних спогадів. Я хотіла подякувати 2 членам команди Наукового товариства в імені Шевченка, Василю Махно, офіс-менеджер та координатор програм, за його зусилля, заохочення, настанови та особливо терпіння, який витримав протягом багатьох років старань, щоб тата книга побачила світ. Дякую, пане Михно. А також Анастасія Денисенко, архівістка та адміністративна асистентка, за її нагляд на технічну допомогу організації фотовиставки. Я також хотіла висловити свою вдячність деяким з моїх друзів, які були таким чудовим джерелом підтримки протягом цієї подорожі. Тамарі Лащик за редакційну експертизу та моральну підтримку. Я ніхто не бачу. Є Тамара. Дякую, Тамара. Андрію Ластовецький. Андрію, дякую за допомогу у фінансуванні фотовиставки та Юлії Маринчак, дякую, Юлія, за українські переклади та за допомогу з організацією та підготовчі фотографії для виставки. Дякую всім і слава Україні! Дякую.
Дуже дякую, пані Стефо. Я хотів би прочитати кілька уривків з цієї книжки. I would like to read a few excerpts from this book in Ukrainian, of course. 1923 рік. Пам'ятаю, що то було 1923 року, у день смерти Тараса Шевченка, 10 березня. Ми всі діти під керівництвом учителя організовано йшли до церкви, де була відправлена панахида. Це був останній раз, коли всі учні організовано йшли в церкву. На вшанування пам'яті великого поета в школі було влаштовано імпрезу. Учень 4-ї класи відчитав реферат про життєпис Шевченка. Після того були декламації, представлена п'єса, щось зі шкільної тематики. Я грав роль учня. На стіні висіла мапа України. Учитель питає мене, куди течуть річки в Україні? Я, не задумуючись, відповідаю, на Україні, як і скрізь, всі течуть згори на низ. І показав руками на мапі. Це викликало сміх на залі. 1942 рік. При листопада нашу групу перевели до СД, Зондердінст або Гестапо. Там кинули нас до кімнати, де було вже яких 50 осіб. Теж лежали покотом один біля одного. Тут уже щодо санітарних умов було надзвичайно брудно. Воші просто заїдали. Кожен сидів і вивертав сорочку чи штани і бив воші. Десь у грудні мене перевели на другий поверх до маленької кімнати, де нас було лише двох. А це тому, що підготовляли нас до допиту, а потім нас розділили. За кілька день нас почали визивати на допит. На допиті мене запитав офіцер СД, що властиво хоче ваша організація? Я відповів йому, самостійної України. А він на то, ви хочете, щоб ми нашою кров'ю здобули вам незалежність? Я пропоную йому, щоб вони використали військовополонених, які майже всі є ворогами комуністичного строю. А він мені на то. Ми самі справимося. Ви повинні всі працювати і працювати. Тільки своєю працею ви здобудете довір'я нашого фюрера. 1947 рік. Український часопис «Неділя», що виходить в Мюнхені 2 лютого 1947 року, подає таку вістку. Голодівка ДП таборі Корнберг. Вчора в ДП таборі Корнберг вибухла масова голодівка українців, як знак протесту проти насильного вивезення осіб і цілих родин, що їм неслушно при перевірці відмовлено прав ДП. Прохання таборової управи, щоб затримати дотичних людей у таборі, поки буде розглянута справа їхнього рекурсу. Не мали успіху. У моменті отримання нами повищої відомості голодівка в таборі продовжувалася уже 3-й день. Дякую.
So I think I've been asked to speak in English, so I will do so. Since the book is only available for the moment in Ukrainian, I think I need to kind of explain a little bit about context. And the first thing I would say is that this is a book that occurs at the time and in the place that Timothy Snyder has called the Bloodlands. And it is an unusually detailed account of the life of, in fact, an ordinary person living in just life-challenging times where life and death is always around him. But it is written in a clear, matter-of-fact tone, without pathos, without any sense of fear. It's a kind of a chronicle of remarkable courage in its tone. It describes terrible things that occurred, but it does so not with a desire to raise people's passions or to relive some of the terrors that the author has seen, but really to leave a record of what has happened, which is, I think, what makes this book and will make this book so valuable. Ukrainians have, in the Ukrainians who lived under Soviet rule and who lived through the Second World War, could not speak openly about the horrors that they encountered, either the horrors under Stalin's occupation or Soviet rule, or the horrors of the Nazi occupation. Ukrainians in the diaspora we're trying to rebuild a part of their own homeland in a new home. And we're not preoccupied with documenting the past because they were trying to preserve the present for the future. And so this book is extremely valuable because it helps us understand some of these things that are not so well chronicled. There is not a huge array of oral history projects, et cetera, and so the Shevchenko Society is to be commended for developing this genre of works, and I hope there are other people in the community who may have some materials that could form a part of this narrative history, that they contact the institution, given what it has been able to achieve in this very clear and interesting memoir. So, everything happens here, but it's written in kind of a, I'm just going through this. There's no glory here. In other words, this is a very modest person who shows a degree of heroism, a commitment to his principles, but he just does so without showing off in this book. There's no showing off. It's just a matter of fact. This is what happens to me. And so, he lives at a time of the Stalin famine. He lives at a time of the Great Terror. He lives at the time of the Nazi occupation. He is, arrested for being in a subversive organization which the Nazis tried to exterminate, a group of nationalists who initially thought that Ukraine would be granted freedom when the Germans occupied their territories, but very soon found out and were targeted for extinction and destruction by the Nazi regime. 4,000 of the members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists were eliminated by the operations of the Nazi secret police. To be sure, some of the members of that organization, both for reasons of infiltration, entered into administrative roles in Nazi-occupied territories. Others were others were turncoats and abandoned their mission and so on. But in fact, he joins this organization. He is caught in this organization, and then he is sent to Buchenwald. He describes sort of the daily life of Buchenwald. We know Buchenwald had 280,000 prisoners of all nationalities, including Jews. 55,000 people were butchered in Buchenwald, and the conditions of nurturing, feeding, labor were extremely difficult. But the author describes this in the only way that he experienced it. This was his ordinary life. This was the fate that war and totalitarianism had created for him for much of his early for his youth and his early adult life. There's a description of the beginning of the liberation of Buchenwald, which was liberated by the U.S. Army. And but before it was liberated, the Americans were bombing the factories and the camp in Buchenwald, where there were hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and about 1,500 of those prisoners were killed on one of those days of the Great Bombing. And there is a bit of a description of walking among, seeing the bodies of dead inmates, and presumably also some Nazis, with their limbs blown off, et cetera, But the author does not dwell on the horrors. He moves on to tell the story and moves on. And I think that, this reflects a kind of a trauma. And I think it may be the proper way to deal with some of these traumas, which is not to dwell on them, to describe them and then to move on. But even just the fact that, he matter-of-factly approaches all these things. There's no sense of panic. There's no sense of fear. There's no sense of dispiritedness. And I think that was one of the instruments that allows him to survive and to move from these amazingly different and deadly environments, playing a dangerous role because he joins a nationalist movement. He deserts, he can be caught. And, he has a description of, evading and being a little bit concerned that someone might turn them in when they go into, I guess, a barn and so on. But again, it's really remarkable how cool, calm, and collected he is in this history. And that also makes it very, I think, valuable for historians and for people who want to get a feel for the period. The war ends. The Americans and the Soviets take kind of joint custody, but since the Americans liberated Buchenwald, they're kind of dividing people up, and then they move them into, I think they decide that they may be ending up in the Soviet zone, so many of these people try to break free from Buchenwald and enter into the Allied zone, and in this case, into the American zone. And so it is with Juchym Harczенko, who ends up in Kornberg in a displaced persons camp, where he becomes a leader. But this is yet another remarkable chronicle, because if you look at, well, first of all, the camp has 2,800 people. But for 2,800 people, in the end, they end up having three churches: an Orthodox church, a Uniate Catholic church, and I think eventually some kind of a Baptist meeting place. There are libraries. There is a newspaper. There is a magazine. There is a magazine. There is theater. There is a dancing ensemble. There is police. There is a kid. There is basically self-rule within this American zone camp, and there are dozens of these camps, or at least more than a dozen of these camps, maybe 20 or so, throughout Germany, where many thousands of Ukrainian displaced persons are to be found. And they all basically kind of replicate this kind of mini country, mini community. There's been some writing about this. There is some documentation of DP life, but this is remarkably rich detail of the day-to-day events. Now, they have self-rule in effect, and your father is, of course, elected the director of this camp. But they have an Eisenhower Square. They have Eisenhower Boulevard, which goes, there's Shevchenko Boulevard, but then on the next side of the street, it changes its name to Eisenhower Boulevard. There's an area, there's a Mazepa Square, there's a Petlura Street, there is a Lesya Ukrainka Street, there's a Lysenko Street. It's kind of astonishing. I'm just trying to see if there's any other American reference, Vulitsa Franka, and so on and so forth. There is a kind of a tense relationship with the Americans, because the Americans are cooperating to some extent with the Soviets, and I think your father is in peril in the sense, because the Americans are determining who is a displaced person that is under their custody, or who is someone who is to be repatriated. And the hunger strike that is referred to in the excerpt that was read in Ukrainian by Vasil Makno speaks about a hunger strike that occurs at precisely that time. So in the end, several hundred of the people in that camp are repatriated to the Soviet Union. There is a conversation, I think, which your father is also a part of, with one of the Soviet guys, who basically says, you will have to go and basically be in slave labor to make up for the crimes that you committed. And of course, not all of these people ended up just simply being taken out. Some people were eventually punished for desertion and executed and so on. But your father escapes from this. I don't know exactly, maybe I missed the details. You can enlighten us a little bit about how he manages this. But he stays with this group, is not repatriated. A lot of Ukrainians were able to come up with false identity papers, some of them attested to by priests, that they came from, if you were from the Polish zone, you were not repatriated. You were able to go forward. Anyway, he assumes a leadership role in this incredibly active displaced persons community. He is in this displaced persons camp for about 3.5, 4 years. Many of our people of my generation, many of our parents, and some of the people here, I think, had the experience of being in these displaced persons camps. And in general, they were like the best days of their lives because the war was over. They had they created a little Ukraine, which is actually more Ukrainian than their actual lives under Polish rule or under Soviet rule. So it was like a blossoming of an imagined nation in these little recreated Ukraines that dotted much of much of Bavaria. Anyway, he assumes his leadership role, and then there is the winding down. First, there is a lot of people are hired to go to work as coal miners and into Belgium. So many leave the camp for that. Eventually, I think 400 or 500 people go for Belgium. Britain becomes a place where many people go. Not that Canada, a large component, about 150 out of that, a couple thousand who had remained, repatriate, come to the United States. So, I to give you to kind of conclude, what we have here is a kind of a microcosm of what would be the fate of a typical Ukrainian, but told by an extraordinary Ukrainian. But this was the fate of millions upon millions of people whose histories are not gathered, who died in ditches, who were shot, who died in combat on many sides of the war, sometimes fighting on both sides simply to survive. Some who elegantly were able to escape and didn't have to go into war for more than, in your father's case, a few days. But it's also there's one other episode that I didn't talk about. He, as a young recruit in the military, is in a parade where he sees General Voroshilov and General Budyonny before the beginning of the major part of the Nazi Russian war in the early, I think in the early stages during the Nazi Soviet pact. And he also sees General Yakir, who was then purged. So there's a lot of a flavor of the pre-war era, the war, daily life along the Dnieper River, Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk, Uman, Dnipropetrovsk, etc. So that also makes the book extremely valuable because it gives you a sense of Soviet life, it gives you a sense of wartime life, it gives you a sense of life under both totalitarian regimes. Some interaction with the United States and U.S. institutions. There's a Miss Davis who is a big favorite of, who seems to be very friendly and encouraging of this community that develops in the Kornberg camp. In any event, it's too bad that it's not yet available in English for those of you who are not Ukrainian speaking. But it's a terrific book, just chock full of details. And I don't know how your father remembers absolutely every person who was in the room. But maybe you could explain that. But as I say, it's just filled with detail. But the most remarkable thing, and the biggest thing, is it is not. It's hard to say because war is a horrible thing, and people who go through war are entitled to wear it on their sleeves. But this is a person who went through all this, who showed remarkable courage and remarkable survival skills. But he simply describes this as what was his ordinary life, which turns out to be very extraordinary. So I'll end with that.
I just wanted to thank you for your excellent synopsis and your wonderful, kind words about my father. There will be a reception following on the third floor, which is very kindly and generously sponsored by the Selka and the Ukrainian Meat Market, East Village Meat Market. So please join us upstairs for some food and refreshments.
And will there be signings and what do you do?
Yes, yes, yes. Of
So
course.
you want
I'll
to
sign-
move the
I will-
merchandise.
Yes, I will absolutely be very happy to sign the books for you. Okay, if you want.
Here or there? Here and there.
Here and there.
And when will the book be available? When will the book be
In English?
in the English?
I just